Director Don Fried, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and privilege for me to be here this evening, talking to you all. Incidentally, I was going to speak about Pakistan and, of course, the history, the culture, the economic prowess, and the politics surrounding our region, which is a very important region in the world. But after this documentary, I'm just wondering where to start because I actually talked a lot about many of the things that I had in mind, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Good in that it gives me a good preamble, and bad in that I might look like repeating some of those things. But hopefully, I can navigate my way around that. 6,000 years ago, there were three major civilizations in the world, as we know it. There was the Egyptian civilization, there was the Sumerian civilization, and there was the Indus Valley civilization. There is a consensus almost of historians, archaeologists, and sociologists that the Indus Valley civilization at the time was the most advanced out of the three. While in Europe and many other parts of the world, including ours as well subsequently, people did not have running water drains, or fabric-based clothes. Thousands of years later, Indus Valley had it in those days. Ruins such as Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and others, they are still a testimony to how advanced that civilization was. So we in Pakistan are the inheritors of that civilization, because Indus Valley civilization roughly corresponds to what is Pakistan today. And why is it called the Indus Valley civilization? Because of the river Indus. The river Indus, which starts from the mighty Himalayas and goes all the way, falls all the way in the Arabian Sea, is roughly what is Pakistan as you saw in that map. Subsequently, we have had a very interesting and rich history. In what is Pakistan today, the Indus Valley, so to speak, was always very attractive for the major empires of the world. There have been invasions in this region, some of the very famous ones. For instance, Alexander, when he was trying to conquer the whole world, this region caught his eye very much. And in fact, it was in this region where he almost had his first military defeat and where he was critically wounded, eventually to die. Then there were others, but within this region, amazing civilizations and faiths emerged. There was the era prior to Hinduism, although very rich civilizationally, there was what you call like the pagan era in today's terminology. Then the Hinduism, then Buddhism. Buddhism emerged from this very region and then spread all over the what was the known world then, particularly in the East. And then there was the advent of Islam. The Arabs came here not much later after Islam began in Saudi Arabia, what is today Saudi Arabia. And Islam had a deep impact in this region. For almost 1,000 years, not just Indus Valley, but the whole of India. big chunks of it were under the Muslim rule, as you know, the sultanates, then the glorious Mughal Empire. And as the Mughal Empire faded, that was the time of beginning of colonialism. We had the Portuguese here in some parts in South Asia. We had the French, but it was the British which emerged victorious, and this whole region became part of the British Empire. After the demise of the British Empire, of course, we had the partition and the two countries, mainly Pakistan and India. 1947. As you have seen in that very interesting documentary, the initial images of that partition. While there was a birth of hope and glory, that birth took place in the pangs of millions of killings, unfortunately, which still have a deep imprint on the politics of the region. But as Pakistan emerged from that deep scar, there was a lot of promise. And Pakistan lived to its promise in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. Even today, Pakistan is a big chunk of South Asia, a country of 200 million people, 4 provinces, as you saw, located at the confluence of 3 regions: South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. It has a remarkable cultural mix because of its history, because of its past. And it's not just a cultural mix, it's an ethnic mix as well. It's a racial mix as well. And that is why in Pakistan, if you go to different parts of Pakistan, you can find people of all sort of complexions and sort of genetic features as well. But besides being a country of 200 million people, Pakistan has some very interesting features. It's a very young country. Look at those. See, now they're very Caucasian features. See, that's the north of Pakistan. And there's a story about that this is the descendant or the left, the remains of Alexander's armies in Pakistan. These people, they still have a very, they're not Muslims. They have a very different culture. They still sort of have some very interesting rituals. So with this type of like a cultural milieu, what have we achieved in the last 60, 70 years? We are a big country, we all know that. We are a young country, not just in terms of the birth, but also in terms of the population that we have today. It's literally decades younger than many of the European populations in terms of the average age of the population. It's a very vibrant society. While there's this sort of, stereotypical image of Pakistan in the West today, that there's a lot of extremism in Pakistan, there's terrorism in Pakistan, there's a lot of, some conflicts in Pakistan, like Shia Sunni or other ethnic conflicts. There's some security issues there. Well, some part of that was true. We have faced the biggest challenge of terrorism in the world in the last 15 years or so. We were in the epicenter of the global terrorism. And why was that? It was because of the Afghan war, the Afghan invasion, by the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in the 70s, 1970s and 80s, starting 1979. It went up to the late 80s. In those days, Pakistan became the epicenter of resistance against the Soviet invasion, because Americans, not just Americans, the whole free world, including all Europeans, they felt that if the Russians were not stopped there, they would just go on and capture capture the warm waters. What warm waters? the Strait of Hormuz, where the 2/3 of the global trade basically passes in those waters. So that was the fear. Communism was on the roll. There was this whole domino theory, and we were supposedly the last bulwark against that. Well, that resistance succeeded, but that succeeded on the shoulders of the religious fervor that was promoted by the West, by the Americans, by everywhere, and we were partners in that, with the CIA, with all sort of, like perhaps the intelligence agency here in Europe as well, agencies in Europe as well, because at that time we were fighting for a cause. The cause succeeded. Russians were defeated in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, that journey of religious fervor turned into a religious extremism. And then it turned against the West and America, and it turned against us, Pakistan as well. Americans left Afghanistan, Europeans left as well, but we were there to suffer the consequences. And it all culminated in 2001 September 11 attacks in the US. And then suddenly everybody came back to the region, because then it was understood that once you start something somewhere, eventually the consequences will reach you. The Americans came back, and of course, at one point we had about 160,000 troops there, including not just the US, but ISAF troops, including every West European country, including Germany, which still has troops there. And that is when we had all those different terrorist organizations of not just that region, but the world, taking establishing safe havens on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the so-called tribal areas that we have. That is what we had to fight. We fought together with ISAF in Afghanistan and Pakistan, of course, on its side of the border. And we suffered together. What has happened in Afghanistan in the last 15 years, we all know how many troops, ISAF troops, have been killed and wounded. What monetary price had to be paid? The Americans are estimated to have spent about over $1 trillion there. And that does not even include the the money spent by other European countries. Pakistan, on its side of the border against the war, in the war against terrorism, has taken losses to the tune of about $140 billion. These are direct costs, direct losses, indirect economic losses. There have been about 60,000 casualties in that war. And of course, the war has in many ways left deep scars on the body politic, on the society, on the culture in Pakistan. But we have fought valiantly, and the results have started coming. In the last 2 years in particular, we have defeated all terrorist organizations who are based on the soil of Pakistan. Thousands of those terrorists have been killed at a huge cost, of course. Terrorism has been wiped out of Pakistan to the tune of 90%. Today, we still have, of course, there's still some terrorists in Pakistan, like they are in France, like they are in Germany, like they are in America. But now we are at a level where we are facing terrorism as much as any major country in the world. As like the countries which are even facing more extreme attacks now than Pakistan, like our brothers Turkey, the countries in the Middle East which are still totally embroiled in terrorism. But Pakistan today has been able to, and we have set an example for the world, because what we have achieved in Pakistan could not be achieved by the militaries of 26 countries on the other side of the border in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan still is facing a much bigger problem of extremism and terrorism. This containing of terrorism gives us hope. In the last 2 or 3 years, our economy has turned into a good story, because before it was being totally decimated, being totally decimated by this terrorism problem. But in the last 2-3 years, it's become a very good story. All the numbers are good, whether it's the foreign reserves, whether it's the inflation which is going down, the interest rate which have gone down, the budgetary deficit which has gone down, the industrial production has gone up, the GDP, now we're in the fifth, the highest GDP growth country in the world. In all areas, there's a vibrant information technology scene in Pakistan. We are now one of the players in the world. Similarly, we have been a player in the textiles, of course, But the more important thing is, it's not even the numbers. It's a feel-good factor in Pakistan. People in Pakistan are are ready for business again. They're open to the world again. A lot of countries have changed their travel advisories for Pakistan, including the UK, which are generally very sensitive to security issues. So in the in the coming years, what we expect in Pakistan is a total turnaround. We already listed, I've been reading all those articles in Economist and Newsweek and many other, the Far Eastern Economic Review, about the emerging Pakistan, which will be one of the global players, inshallah, in the coming decades. That is the side of Pakistan which is not well known, which has not sunk into the minds of, let's say the business leaders in Europe, in other parts of the world yet. So this is the, this is the picture of Pakistan, which we want to bring forth, because the stereotypical image of Pakistan might have reflected the reality there of 10 years back, of 8 years back, of 7 years back, but it does not reflect the reality of Pakistan that is there today. You might be seeing all these beautiful images. If you go to Pakistan today, you'd be pleasantly surprised. And that is what is told to me by many friends from here who visit Pakistan, whether for business or for some exchanges, or even on an official visit. You see booming cities there, large cities such as Karachi, 20 million people, or Lahore, which is the cultural heartland, 8 to 9 million people, or Islamabad, Rawalpindi, the twin cities, 5 million people. Fashion scene is booming there. Cultural events are taking place there. Industry and economy, you see people busy in those in their different vocations. It's just like any booming country in the world. And the opportunities there are just amazing. Because it was perceived as a high-risk country in business, there was less investment coming there from Germany and Europe in general in recent years. But that has been a loss, because those who have invested there, in the area of energy, for instance. I know an American company which invested there 10, 15 years back. They stayed there while the situation was pretty bad, although they were based in Balochistan, with the name of Huge Power. They had a $500 million investment. But even despite all the problems that Pakistan was facing, they were making money to the tune that it was so profitable that they decided to double their investment a few years back, while everybody else was looking at Pakistan with as a high-risk country in terms of investment. Similarly, there's a lot of other success stories. Companies from Germany, Metro, for instance, recently they met me. They said we are opening 20 new stores in Pakistan. We are expanding very fast there. Many other companies like Siemens, China, which is because they are in the region, they understand the region better than others. They are right now, as we speak, involved in a huge mega investment project in Pakistan called the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's a $46 billion worth of, not of one project, but different projects in the area of energy, infrastructure development. They are they'll be working with us for development of this new port, which is already operational, Gawada. And Gawada is a critically important port because, because of its location along the Strait of Hormuz on the Arabian Sea. And for Chinese, it's kind of, there's a vital importance because that is their alternative route. They have this main sort of trade, their main trade carried through the South China Sea. But they have been but they want an alternative route as well. And this route also cuts sharply the distance from China's western region to Arabian Sea, cuts it by more than 50%. So it's a much more economical route for them as well. You might have heard about China's One Belt, One Road project, which is almost like a dream. It's so ambitious because China is now one of the biggest, it's probably going in the few years, in terms of purchasing power parity, it's still the biggest. It is now the biggest economy in the world. In terms of nominal dollars, it's set to surpass the US in 10 or 15 years. But it's already the biggest trading nation in the world. And it wants to set up a trade route based on the idea of the original Silk Route that had woven China and all the known world in those days, thousands of years back. So now they have this dream of weaving the world in a one belt, one road project, for greater trade, for easier trade, for quicker trade. And we are a big part of that project. So that $46 billion worth of investment in the first phase, and it increases to $72 billion in the second phase, will transform Pakistan's infrastructure. And so, in energy and road, rail infrastructure. So that brings us to a point where we see a huge opportunity in Pakistan, whether in terms of trade, investment, business, or in terms of cultural exchanges, or in terms of the emerging players in international politics in the world, for countries to interact with, for together for regional and global peace and stability. Now, Pakistan is located in South Asia, as you know. South Asia is literally 1/4 or 1/5 of the humanity in terms of the population. We are talking about literally 2 billion, 1.7 billion population of a region. If you include China to that, of course, then we're talking about half the world population. But South Asia itself is growing as high now as China is. Now, as you might have known, India's GDP growth rate has now presently surpassed that of China. Same is the case with other countries in South Asia. Pakistan is 5.7%, fifth highest in the world right now. So this is now the region which would become the engine of world's economy. This will be the region which will surpass in the coming years the GDP of probably the entire Europe. And the whole world is interested in fostering greater economic cooperation with this region. But it's not happening at the pace that it should be happening. What is the reason? The reason is that the South Asia is facing some political challenges, some security challenges. And why do we have those challenges? It's simply because of the the problems, the issues between two of the protagonists of the region, two of the leading players of the region. And who are those two leading players? India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, the way partition happened, it left some unfinished agenda, primarily the dispute of Kashmir. You must have heard about that. And that, unfortunately, is basically hampering the peaceful relations between Pakistan and India, and thus hampering the development of the region. There's this organization called SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. SAARC is 1.7 billion people, but unfortunately, intra-trade SAARC is not yet anything to boast of. And again, because of this problem between India and Pakistan. We are trying to resolve that. Pakistan and India had entered into various dialogues, into various mechanisms called a composite dialogue. But the problem is that, like when it comes to Kashmir, then the will is not there. There are United Nations Security Council resolutions on Kashmir because it's a disputed region. I'm not going to go deep into the history of Kashmir, but suffice to say, it's a region which is, it's a beautiful region, perhaps more beautiful than Switzerland. But it's a disputed region. When Pakistan and India were partitioned, Kashmir, we feel, should have been a part of Pakistan. India occupied 2/3 of it. 1/3 is kind of, is basically Azad Kashmir, like free Kashmir, so to speak. But it was decided by the UNSC, United Nations Security Council, that there'll be a plebiscite in Kashmir, and they will decide where they want to go. Unfortunately, we always wanted to have that plebiscite, but India they agreed. They promised to have that plebiscite, but then somehow they changed their mind. And even today, the Kashmiris, they're striving for their right of self-determination for that plebiscite, so they could decide the issue on the basis of their aspirations. Now, it's very interesting that in Europe, and I see even in Canada, the countries have no problem having plebiscites. There was recently a plebiscite a few years back in Scotland. They said, okay, there was a movement there for being independent. They said, okay, you want to be independent? Have a plebiscite. And then, of course, as you know, in plebiscite, those who wanted independence, they were defeated. Similarly, in Canada, there was this state of Quebec, which had long aspired for independence. And then they say, okay, you want that, have a plebiscite. So sometimes, Europeans find it hard to understand why could, there be no plebiscite so that the people decide. But the politics of the region is much more complex than that. Unfortunately, in the recent days, there have been as has been happening since 1980s, again, a populist movement for the right of self-determination, which has been rather very kind of strongly crushed. And the images coming out from there, with all those I think social media is awash with that. They unfortunately do not really create a very conducive environment for Pakistan and India to build trade and to build their relations and for which there's so much potential, to be honest. I've been to India a few times because my father actually came from what is today India. And that's an interesting fact, how our history is intertwined. The Indian ambassador here and we actually, we have, our origin is from the same city, Amritsar, So, but despite that, the history is, it's so intertwined. And there's so much goodwill sometimes between the people. Whenever I go to India, it's an amazing goodwill that you find there. And when Indians come to Pakistan, again, people-to-people level, there's an amazing goodwill. But somehow, these issues have not been, the governments have not been able to resolve the issue, particularly as per the the advice of the United Nations Security Council. And because of that, peace is still elusive in that region. Because if we have peace in that region between India and Pakistan, that region is probably is not just the new China. It will be much bigger than the China story, because already the GDP growth rate there has surpassed China, as I mentioned. But the actual potential there is just amazing. It's waiting to be tapped. That is the only barrier which is stopping that region from becoming, not just the next China, but becoming the engine of world growth for the next 30 years. And that is something that the world direly needs. As we all know, Europe is in some sort of, not a recession, but in a recessionary environment. America is not doing great economically, neither is Japan. Japan is in a recessionary environment again. Europe today is awash with so much money, that if you go to a bank, we recently had we actually had a very interesting conversation with the bank. We said, we want to have an account we have an account there. We said we're going to put 2 million euros there, fixed. What interest do you give us? You know what they said? 0%. In fact, you will have to pay us 900 euros a month to keep the money there. So Europe is, the capital has no value in Europe today in terms of, the return of investment and equity, in this type of environment. In South Asia, that 2 million euro could be sort of, could be just amazing, outrightly sought after. And there's so much potential for that 2 million euros to make like 15, 20, 25% return on an equity for a year. But for this this security challenge, as you know, we have both nuclear powers as well, Pakistan and India. We have two of the very few nuclear powers in the world. And that again brings an element of insecurity in the region. Two nuclear powers, having problems with each other, having territorial disputes with each other. It's a nightmarish scenario. So we hope that, we would be able to have a serious, meaningful dialogue with India, as both countries have been claiming to want. And this problem would be resolved, to the not just to the wishes of the two countries, but more importantly to the aspirations of the Kashmiri people, so that, they live in peace, the region lives in peace, and moves forward in its journey of hope and development and prosperity. Thank you.